Welcome to Wider View. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway, and my guest this week is Barbara Boland. Barbara is a writer on U.S. foreign policy who gets articles published in the American Conservative and Responsible Statecraft and various other places, and it was great talking with her again. So here's my interview with Barbara Boland. So, Barbara, you just had this article published by Responsible Statecraft, which is part of the Quincy Institute, entitled "Is Biden Using a Trump Card to Pressure the Maduro Regime Change in Venezuela?" So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that article, why you wrote it, and what about this Biden using the Trump card?
Well, Biden has been continuing the policies of the Trump administration, both in Venezuela and with regards to Iran. The financial sanctions, which have been really quite crippling towards Venezuela. A lot of people don't realize that what we think of as Venezuela's economic collapse has really been necessitated by our financial sanctions on the country. And so that's what my article was about. And it's also about this UN report on how our sanctions have caused this humanitarian crisis, which, in the middle of a pandemic is particularly cruel and is awful. And then that we should really ease up on that and allow medicines and food to be purchased by the country, basically unfreeze their assets because they have several billion dollars offshore. But what was interesting to me was that I had, and none of the major, with the exception of CNN, none of the major media outlets covered the fact that the UN had even issued this report at all. So no one, basically, you would be hard pressed to even know that a humanitarian crisis that's occurring in Venezuela is the result of our policies there.
Right.
And I find that, I just reading about how these 4 to 5 million people have left Venezuela because of what we have done to the country. And it's just, we have caused this. And then, of course, you see this crisis unfolding at the border. And it's sort of like we create these problems and then we just one situation after another, and we kind of throw up our hands if we don't understand how one thing leads to another.
Right. Well, and I think one thing that the UN Special Rapporteur noted that probably kept her report out of the mainstream media was that she noted that it was inadmissible, illegal, really, to apply sanctions extraterritorially, and that the U.S. sanctions that are being on Venezuela are basically violations of international law and human rights. And I think that would apply to our sanctions on certainly on Iran and possibly Syria as well.
Yes, our sanctions on these sanctions, financial sanctions of these kind are violations of international law because they punish the populations. And it's so ironic when you really think about it. Here we are saying we're going to punish some person that we claim is this awful dictator that doesn't care about his people, and then we're going to do that by what? Starving their people. Yeah, okay, that's going to work. And by the way, it never does in Iran now. So, and also in Venezuela, eventually the people that are left behind, that are starved and left without medicines, they end up being embittered and buckling down on behind the leader very often, rather than, you know, coming, you know, I think I quoted at the end of the article something, you know, I was interviewing really awful quotes from the Trump administration, where I think it was Bill Barr has said something about how they're expecting regime change from Venezuela, and believe also Bolton making some comment about the Star Wars and Darth Vader. But this is not, it's good timing actually that sanctions be applied during a pandemic. Only really barbaric people can possibly think this way.
Right.
I just another article about how the sanctions are affecting the people of Iran, and you'll see in other sources that some people try to argue that sanctions are not really they technically aren't supposed to be applied to medicines or food, but they are.
They are.
Because it's impossible to so many things get caught up in sanctions and in banking, and right now they're saying that food prices just during Biden's time in office, food prices in Iran have gone up 7%. And one of the surprises to me has been noticing that the Biden administration has been a lot more militant about doubling down in their approach to Iran and keeping all of the sanctions and all of this maximum pressure, you know, to quote Pompeo's terminology, that approach towards Iran.
Yeah.
Really keeping all of that in place. Very strange, in my opinion.
It is very strange. Yeah. And I think, because I think when Biden was at the very beginning of his administration issuing executive orders right and left, I mean, he could have eliminated, at least all the sanctions on Iran that were created by executive order or by executive departments, and that would have undoubtedly brought Iran, we would all be back in the deal. But he didn't do it. And the other thing about sanctions that sanctions are going to basically rally a population together. If you attack the country is going to unite to repel the attack. So that's one effect. The second effect is it's going to drive that country into the arms, as it were, of nations that are outside the U.S. framework, the so-called rules-based international order. So, Venezuela and Iran are going to go to China and Russia for help, and probably get it. And the other thing, which I think is happening right now in Iran, is that because Iran has an election coming up, later this year, is that the most right wing or the most conservative anti-U.S. factions in their political environment are probably going to come to power because, now the more liberal factions that negotiated the JCPOA in the first place are considered weak.
Yeah, because unfortunately you have this damned if you do and damned if you don't sort of approach that's playing out here. I mean, on the one hand, with Iran, we are the ones, the U.S. broke the Iran deal. We pulled out of it. We broke it. So we should be the ones to have to make the first move. However, the Biden administration is saying kind of oddly that they're going to wait for Iran to make the first move. So Iran is now saying, well, we're not making the first move because you guys broke the deal. So yeah, it's completely out of stalemate.
No. Yeah. Well, it's politically impossible for the Iranian government. I mean, it's internally politically impossible for them to give in. That would be, it'd be political suicide in Iran.
Right. And there is, from what I've been told from different sources here in DC, sort of there's a thought that part of why the Biden administration is being cautious in their approach about how they are strategizing, I guess, and handling the JCPOA is that they have to get their nominees through the Senate, and they've got a very hawkish, Senator Menendez is in charge of that Senate committee. He can basically, and because of the breakdown of the Senate right now, any senator can sort of hold up the nomination. So they're trying to play this as coolly as they can. That's one interpretation of what's going on here. On the other hand, what I am seeing, or what I think is really happening, is that it seems to be a not very sophisticated approach. I mean, when you have Biden saying that Putin is a killer with no soul, and
God.
then I don't, and then you have the sort of disastrous, and I have to call it disastrous because I don't know how else to spin that meeting between Secretary of State Blinken and the National Security Advisor and the Chinese last
the Alaska
weekend.
meeting.
Yes, where they traded insults for, and also that was supposed to be just a couple of minutes. The Americans had originally prepared only 4 minutes of remarks, and then the Chinese, bombarded us with 15 minutes of insults. So, Secretary, so then I don't. That type of thing to me looks like a not sophisticated administration or people. I don't know exactly how else to describe what's happening there.
Well, it seems, I mean, I come back, and as I was joking with you earlier, I mean, it's like nobody's minding the store. I mean, there's no sense here of this is our policy and this is how our policy differs from the Trump policy or the Obama policy, and this is what we want to achieve for the United States. It's just it seems to be scattershot, and pretty much, we are the boss, and if you guys don't like it, then stuff it. And both toward the allies and so-called enemies. So it really is. I don't understand what they think they're going to achieve here.
It is puzzling. I mean, and then you also have, on top of the continuation of the Trump policies with the sanctions, the addition of the threats of with the pipelines towards Russia, and also these bizarrely that we're also threatening to sanction Germany now because of their cooperation with Russia on a pipeline. I mean, this is all it is a little bit scattershot, yes, I would say. You would think that Biden's people, or at least the way that it was sold in the media, was sort of this very experienced in hands, right? This is, if anything, they've been in DC for so long that they're supposed to be, But that's not exactly the look that you're getting from what's happening here on the foreign policy front.
And we were told that Blinken had been Biden's, foreign policy aide for many, many years, and they trusted each other implicitly, and yada yada, and yet, I mean, it does seem that Blinken is basically, I mean, he could be Pompeo with just a sort of, a slightly less hostile approach.
Yeah, and that is a little bit too. I mean, there've been joking memes floating around about that on the internet. That after Biden ordered the bombing in Syria,
Yeah.
sort of that this is just the Biden administration is like Trump, but it has uses the proper pronouns maybe.
Yeah.
Using. Yeah.
Well, and it's what I think is especially distressing. I mean, maybe you agree or not, but is that Biden having taken charge when he did, and having, although not certainly not a landslide victory, but or perhaps not even a victory, depending on who you're talking to, but he had the opportunity to certainly to restore the JCPOA to functioning almost immediately, to get us out of Afghanistan by May the 1st at the latest, to pretty much immediately leave Syria. And he's done none of those things.
It is very interesting to me as well that we're also seeing news reports today saying that he's not even going to, and this one seems like just such an easy victory for him, politically speaking, where he can just remove the remaining 1,500 troops that are in Afghanistan. Even if Afghanistan falls into a civil war after the Americans leave, which we know it will because it's been in a suspended state of civil war now for like 30 years, but and we can't stop that, and we're not able to do that. But in any event, Biden can fulfill our word that the Trump administration gave to the Taliban, take the troops out May 1, and then he can blame it on Trump because it was made on the Trump administration. So to me, it's such an easy political win. It's also something over 70% of Americans believe we should do. And yet I'm seeing the reports are saying we just can't organize to get all of them out of Afghanistan in 6 weeks' time. We need more time. We're going to have to take more time to get them out. Like somehow they can't even do that.
No.
And if you think about it, if you can't get the troops out of Afghanistan, and it's been 19 years, then what can they do on a foreign policy front? I mean, that is such an easy win. Again, it's something where it was just handed to them.
Yeah.
I don't know. Again, it just and also Biden was not even for going into Afghanistan in the first place. So you would think, why can't he just do this one? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think he could have easily. I mean, Trump was trying to get out of Syria, I think, at some points, but I think he was frustrated in part because, at least from my vantage point, you probably know better, but he was frustrated in part because the Defense Department and the intelligence agencies and the others did not want to leave Syria, and so he was getting pushback, and of course the Israelis don't want the U.S. to leave Syria either, but there was he did his best, and it certainly would have been possible for an astute president to have finished that job.
Yeah, Trump got pushback from Mattis on Syria, and Trump did not understand how to use like the levers of government. Now that's not something that the Biden administration is supposed to have that problem because, right. So what we're seeing now is people that are experienced with government but are still stumbling, inexplicably stumbling in ways that are definitely quite surprising, because when, some of what I'm seeing, especially in the foreign policy front, is worrying. Like the meeting with the Chinese,
Mm-hmm.
that looked like amateur hour. In fact, it looked like the kind of thing that I would have expected, or actually used to actively worry about from Trump. But
Mm-hmm.
then it comes from the supposedly experienced hands,
Right.
and yeah, it's concerning. And it may be that, there's a collective loss of respect that the US
Mm-hmm.
has had, and that maybe they could blame on Trump. But I think that um, there's also got to be
Well,
a
yeah.
yeah, there has to be a bit of a, like, a reckoning in general.
Yeah, I think part of it is Trump, and I think part of it is, although these are related, the absolutely abominable response to the COVID-19
Yes.
crisis here. Um, so that, and not to mention we have riots in the streets and people, entering the Capitol building and waving flags around, and it does not look like we are the nation that should be talking to others about democracy and human rights, for one thing. Um, I wonder what you think about this. I was reading an article by Alfred McCoy recently, where he said that the illusions of omnipotence can send fading empires crashing into oblivion. And it struck me that could be a part of what's going on here. Do you think?
Yeah, I agree. That's a very well written statement. I and I really think that those images, I mean, personally, I was sickened by the insurrection at the Capitol building,
Right.
and I think
Mm-hmm.
that had a very negative um, impact on how other countries view us, that Americans maybe haven't fully, um, probably American foreign policy hands, especially like the intelligentsia media, maybe haven't
Mm-hmm.
fully kind of reckoned with yet. For
Yeah.
instance, that may have had a true impact on the way that the Chinese treated us, just the other, last week.
Mm-hmm.
But it definitely also, it is affected by the coronavirus,
Mm-hmm.
by everything else, by the fact that we are really divided, that we couldn't figure
Absolutely.
out how what was going on with our election for so long. All of it. It's
Yeah.
been a very difficult year in
Mm-hmm.
general.
Yeah, it has.
Yeah.
And what do you think about Biden himself? I mean, there are a lot of rumors going around, and certainly his actions don't do anything to dispel them, that he isn't exactly operating at his full mental capacity. Um, and, he doesn't seem to be, to me at least, to be actively in charge. This seems to be one of these, where everyone else is just off doing their thing.
Well, I
I mean,
think it's concerning when they don't really allow him to. They don't allow a lot of press access to him.
mm-hmm,
And we know that he has a stutter, obviously, but it does feel like there's cognitive decline there.
mm-hmm,
And I think that I think that's kind of undeniable.
mm-hmm,
It's unfortunately a little scary. Then you have the issues of, at a time like that, all of the other players in the government, like this technically, well, you could just take it from in the Trump administration
mm-hmm,
too. Um, but in every administration, the vice president, the secretary of state, all those chief, the department heads tend to start wanting to move in, especially if the president is, like, sort of weakened. So that's worrying as well, and I'm sure that it's something that other countries like Russia and China are looking at. But
Hmm.
I mean, how concerning should that be? I don't. It's very difficult to say, especially when we really do have so very little access to him. I mean, and on the one hand, it's definitely a relief after we had overexposure with Trump,
Hmm.
all that constant exposure. But
Right.
but we needed like a break. But I do feel like um, it would be more reassuring if it was evident that he had like a firm grasp, and part of that concern, at least for me, is sort of on these types of issues. Like,
Hmm.
I don't have you when you know a person like Biden, from everything that we know about him, from all of his time in government, he was always very assertive in the Obama administration
Hmm.
in expressing his opinion about, you know, these Obama's foreign
Hmm.
policy
Right.
interventions,
Hmm.
and he didn't think that Obama should bomb Libya, and he didn't want to invade Afghanistan. And so you would really think that if Biden was really there right now, like leading strongly, that he would want to get out of Afghanistan. That's just the feeling that I have, but it's hard to know.
Yeah, and it's hard to know if, I mean, the problem you have, I think, at least I'm sitting over here in Oregon, so I'm far away from DC, and might get these wrong, but what it seems to me that there are, powerful interests in Washington that have very clear ideas about what they want to do in almost every policy area you could name. I mean, it's hard to think of a policy area in which there is not some sort of uh, pressure group or influential donor group or whatever that has an agenda
Right.
for it. And the only way it seems to me that one could govern is to be able uh, to reject some of those agendas some of the time, at least. And I don't see that happening. I mean, I think that's what you're referring to, in your article, and what other people are saying about this. They're just attacking everyone.
The other thing, of course, is Biden certainly would not be the first senator to become president whose foreign policy views change and
Yes,
warp
changed. Yes.
warp to become the very very different and very much more the establishment. It seems to be so difficult to pull out of a country or to not go to not bomb somewhere as a
Yes.
president.
Yeah, it really is. And what concerns me as well, and I know a lot of conservatives have voiced this concern, is that should Biden, for whatever reason, uh, stop acting as president, um, that Kamala Harris does not seem to be uh, a good alternative at this point. I don't
On
know
the
how you
foreign
feel.
policy,
Yeah.
she's I'm not sure that her views are very. I mean, she would probably be a pretty establishment voice. I'm
Yeah, I would think so.
reasonably certain. That's, definitely her history in California, I think, would lead one to assume this. So,
Hmm.
but that's just unfortunately, I think, reality at this point. What you've come to see in DC mostly from everybody is you sort of get the same thing no matter which party or
Hmm.
which cast of characters.
Yeah, yeah. And that I think is the most distressing of all, because I mean it gets you into the position of thinking, well, the political system isn't working, because we're not really being given choices, at least in the foreign policy arena. There are some differences with in domestic policy,
Right.
or at least domestic policy rhetoric between the two parties. But yeah, there doesn't seem to be very much difference on foreign policy or military policy. Yeah.
And that's, I mean, at this point, the other major, I suppose, issues are going to be, I mean, we already saw that Congress, the budget for the military, they approved this,
Mm-hmm.
they approved it at the same numbers, slightly increased. So, I mean, this has been quite unprecedented as well, where the military is just getting free handouts at larger and
Yeah.
larger amounts year after year.
Mm-hmm.
So at that rate, too, you also have to think that we're not going to see wars or the military industrial complex reduce itself on its own,
Mm-hmm. No.
and then this year in particular, I think something completely unprecedented, because the Pentagon got more than what they had even. I mean, it's just at this point, it's like freebies. So.
Yeah. Well, that's happened a number of times before in the past, hasn't it? Where the president's budget is increased for the Pentagon by the Congress. The Congress increases the amount for the Pentagon in the budget.
Well, Congress sometimes does, but this year there wasn't even argument. I mean, I guess we have now come to that. That was something that was very interesting. And in the Trump years, we saw that the right gave up the ghost on pretending that they care about budgets or the deficit or debt or anything like that. And now, we are now at a point where we're spending insane amounts of money and approving. So they improved a ton of money for the military, also for obviously the pandemic related spending, but
Right.
there's also a ton. I mean, they called it coronavirus related, but usually a lot of it was. And that's been another absolutely astounding, eye-popping, really, when you look at the amount of money that we spend on war and weapons, things that don't even work,
Right.
weapon systems versus vaccines like the coronavirus vaccine or mRNA vaccines, that these vaccines are actually relatively cheap, especially in comparison with like one aircraft carrier. In some cases, can't even launch the aircrafts that they were designed to launch.
Right.
But I wish I was joking, but that's actually
That's
one
true.
of yeah.
Yes, we have planes that can't fly and ships that can't sail. Yes.
Yeah, but it's actually just so that we can employ people, because mostly this is about the jobs. I don't know what it's actually for. But yeah, so we could, to me, the amount of money that can be saved. I mean, when you really think about the science behind the vaccines and even the questions of the supply chain, I think that that's probably more interesting. But of course, I don't really see too many of the political leaders going this direction.
Yeah, there seems to be a thing, and I mean, I see it mostly towards China at this point, but part of the problem, or the challenge, as they say in Washington with China, is that they are beating us in competitions for a number of things, whether it's 5G or any number of areas. But what we intend to do is like force them not to compete or something, instead of building up our own industries and our own infrastructure, and working to make us better competitors, to make us winners. And so all of our money is being shoved over in the military bucket, and nothing is left to help grow our economy, to build manufacturing jobs, to help to repair our infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, it's sort of like a reach for a loop, like a World War II maybe, replay over and over without looking at some of the failures along the way, like Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan. And instead of learning the mistakes, we just keep thinking of and even a romanticized, actually, I would have to say, view of World War II. And then sort of this, so we take that and then, okay, how can we fit that into what's happening? There's definitely a scary militarized view of China that's taking place, and it seems to be taking hold of both the left and the right, and
Yes.
that's a little reminiscent, I think, of the lead up to the Iraq War. So I hope that that's not a preview, because it is worrying, especially with what happened last week with the Chinese delegation in Alaska.
Yes.
I'm not sure where that's all heading, because we obviously can't have a war with China, like that. There's not anything useful or productive at all that could come of that.
No, and to be honest, we haven't won a war in 75 years. Even though we fought a lot of them. I suppose that you could count Grenada in Panama, but I mean, really, it's, so I don't think there's a really good shot that we have of coming out on top in such a war. But yeah, and there's so many more issues. I mean, I think we could talk about the economy as well, but that's a whole other. I think we'll have to save that for the next time.
Yes.
So no, where are you mostly trying to get your work published at this point, by the way?
Probably will continue to see it on the Responsible Statecraft for now.
Yeah. You're not going to do a Substack for us like everyone else?
Probably that as well.
Yeah, good. Yeah. No, I'm now following, I think, 6 or 7 different Substacks. It seems to be that all the people I enjoy reading now are writing over there, rather than for anybody else. But yeah, I think it's part of what you were saying before. I mean, it's that when it comes to foreign policy, particularly, or military policy, which is in the U.S. unfortunately the same thing. Both the right and the left, whether you're listening to Fox or MSNBC, you're going to get the establishment perspective. Now you'll have some nuanced differences, but not very many, it seems to me. And I think you're right that's very concerning. But we haven't been able to get anti-war voices into the mainstream really since Vietnam.
Unless you consider Bernie Sanders' success as it might be. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure Bernie is the ultimate anti-war candidate. And also, he didn't talk a lot about foreign policy. He was mostly working. He mostly talked about domestic policy, economic policy.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's interesting, though, that the last few presidents that we've had, did say that they were against. I mean, they voted against the wars, but then, like I said, becoming president, then it changes
Yep.
everything.
It seems to.
Yeah. But I would love to see the U.S. change its approach to foreign policy from this militant, like funding weapons type of ideas
Hmm.
towards something more similar to what China has done with funding the Silk Road and also their Confucius academies. Like if you actually think about the way that they have done that and their investment in countries around the world, that's a so much smarter way of if you're going if
Absolutely. Hmm.
it's just that's you want to talk about soft power, why aren't we doing that? I mean, I
Well,
don't ever
yeah.
understand.
Yeah. Well,
we're we're moving aircraft carriers over into the Persian Gulf in order to, like, I don't know, scare scare
yeah.
Iran. I don't know why we're doing it that way. It just that seems like a very we're playing risk, the board game, instead of the
Mhm.
real life.
Yeah. It's pretty crazy. Well, I'm going to probably have to stop us here, but I really thank you very much again, Barbara, for joining me and for reaching out, and I wish you very well.
Thank you.
Okay, and thanks again to Barbara Boland for joining me. If you want to see her work, there's going to be a little more of it on the Responsible Statecraft site, so just Google Responsible Statecraft and you'll find it. And if you haven't been to that site before, I strongly recommend it. They have some very thoughtful and interesting articles on foreign policy there by top people. It's really worth your time to check that out. But anyway, this is Wider View Radio, and I thank you for listening. And I'm your host again, Charles Dunaway. Thanks.